Okay guys, we're going to give you a little tutorial here on soldering new connectors on some LiPo batteries. One of the key tools that I like to use is this little plastic jaw device, available at most local hobby shops. I suggest you get one. But I recently picked up 3 new batteries, and of course I use Dean's connectors on my batteries, and very seldom do the batteries come with them, so I've got 3 Dean's females plugs and 1 male plug. I kind of like these because they're impossible to put in backwards. They provide good current flow with very little heat buildup, and they're easy to get, they're cheap, and easy to solder to. So this is the male. That's what you would put inside your plane. I'm going to use it as a heat sink today, just to keep from deforming the plastic on the females. So also I use Kester solder. It's called, I think it's called Kester 44 rosin core. It's like 32nd inch diameter. It's pretty good stuff. And I've got a nice Weller soldering station with a digital temperature setting. You can set the temperature to just about anything you want. I run it at about 725, and just leave it there. It'll automatically adjust to that. And then it's got a separate pencil and pencil stand. Another thing that's important is the little sponge that comes on the pencil stand. You want to keep that wet. You don't have to soak it, but you need it at least partially wet so that you can wipe the slag off of your soldering iron. See how that's got junk on the end of it, and it's kind of a gold color. You wipe it off, gets rid of the junk, makes it nice and shiny silver, which is what you want. Okay, so I mentioned using the male connector as a heat sink. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug the male connector into the female connector. That way, as I heat up the female connector, it won't deform the plastic and make the connections move inside the plastic. So once you got them together, though, it's kind of hard to tell which one's which. So that I know for the remainder of the day which side is the male, I'm going to go ahead and mark it with the little Sharpie marker so that I know that's not the one I want to solder to. That's just the heatsink male. So now that it's marked, double check it. The marked one is the male, which I don't want to solder to. So now I'm going to plug that together, stick it in the vise. And soldering these connectors is relatively easy. The key is to get the right amount of heat onto the connections, and the key is to, when using just 2 hands, the key is to tin the ends of both the wire and the connector. So I'm going to tin this connector, both top and bottom, and both sides of the connector. Basically what tinning does is it puts a fair amount of solder onto the connector. Makes it adhere well to these are actually gold-plated connectors. It makes it adhere well to the gold. And you can see there we've got a nice little bump of solder on the top and on the side. So now I'm going to take my battery out, brand new battery. This is from our favorite retailer, Hobby King. It's a Zippy Flight Max battery, 2200 milliamp hour 3-cell. And here's another important thing to remember is when you take the old connector off, you only want to cut 1 wire of the original connector at a time. That way you don't have 2 exposed plus and minuses, because if you short those 2 together, it will ruin your battery. So we're going to take the positive wire off of the existing connector, and then with an X-Acto knife, nice sharp X-Acto knife, we're going to take about 1/8 of an inch of the insulation off, just rolling it between my thumb and the knife very gently. Pop the insulation off to expose the wire, and then kind of work the wire so that it's all together but kind of flat, not round. I'm going to use, I have red and black heat shrink. There's no requirement that red has to go on red, but I have it, so I use it. I'm going to cut about 1/2 of an inch length off of that. The diameter of this I think is 3/8 of an inch, and it shrinks down to 3/16. I've got black and red. So now I'm going to tin the wire on the positive lead of the battery, same way I did the connector on the Dean's connector, the terminal. Get a little bit of solder on the iron, and then basically let that solder get the wire hot, and then feed solder into the wire. And the key here is to let solder flow all the way through, around and inside the wire. You want that end of that wire to be all shiny with solder all the way around. Everything you can see should have solder covering it, and like as I said, the solder will flow inside the strands of the wire and kind of bond them together inside with solder. It's going to take a lot of heat. That wire is going to get very hot, so you want to just not hold on to it. Just flow that solder into that wire, and then here I'm going to blow on it a little bit, and then let it cool, and then slip the heat shrink tubing over it. And I'm going to put the heat shrink tubing when I get it cool enough. So something that's important to take note of is that if you put the heat shrink on there too soon, the heat from that soldering iron that you used to tin the wire will actually cause the heat shrink tubing to shrink. So you got to let it get cool enough to slide that on there. Slide it all the way down as far as you can, because you're going to heat the wire up again to solder it to the connector. You don't want that heat shrink to shrink on you. So now to make this connection, I'm going to add a little bit of solder to the iron to help it flow, and then I'm going to melt that solder that's on the wire that I've tinned on there, and then I'm going to use that heat to melt the solder that I've tinned on the connector. And if you just work that wire back and forth on the connector, you'll feel it. You'll feel when you get to the wire touching the metal where all the solder is molten. And then once you get that where you can feel it rubbing, get your iron off of there and let it cool. And then you inspect that joint and make sure it's just good and shiny, and that you don't have any exposed bare wire with no solder on it. And once you're satisfied with that, this one looks pretty good. Looks like it's got a good solid connection. We'll let it cool enough until we can then slide up the heat shrink tubing. You like to do this fairly quickly so that if there is any residual heat there, it won't shrink the tubing on you. And now that that joint is protected and will not short anything, I can cut off the black lead, the negative terminal. Oh. And I've got a box full of those. I'll save that. I don't know what I'll ever do with them. Maybe one day I'll sell them as a lot, but same kind of deal. We're going to just do this again. We're going to take about 1/8 of an inch off of the insulation, gather that wire together and flatten it out a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and load the connector into the vise to keep this in a position where I can get at it with 2 hands. And then tin that wire the same way I did the positive one. So we're going to basically just heat that wire up with solder, make sure that solder flows all the way through the wire, inside and out, until I see nothing but shiny. Gonna take maybe 2.5, or maybe even 3 inches of solder to get all that solder full, all that wire filled with solder to the point it needs to be. All right, we're gonna cool that off a little bit. We'll go ahead and cut the insulation, the heat shrink tubing, and pop that on there. And then same drill as the positive lead, we're going to just add a little bit of solder to the iron, melt both tinnings on the connector and on the wire, and then just move that wire back and forth until we can feel the metal to metal rubbing, and then once it's seated all the way down and touching, we can get off of that, inspect it, make sure we got a good solder joint. Looks pretty good to me. I'm gonna let that cool, and then slide the heat shrink up quickly. And I've got I got this from Harbor Freight, the wonderful Chinese tool distributor. This is an 1800 watt heat gun, 1500 watt heat gun, and it works extremely well for shrinking heat shrink tubing, as well as working on film coverings and things like that. But it seems like I use it more and more for this than anything. Just hit that to shrink the tubing down around the joints, and there you go. You can unplug your, take the heatsink connector off of there. And there you go. That battery's ready to charge and fly. In fast motion here, we're going to do a couple more, and then hopefully you'll be ready to do your own. Have a good day. Thanks for watching. Bye.